Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. I know you often think of, boy, these narcissistic people come up with some interesting excuses for their behavior, and that's what this series is going to be taken on. The excuses that narcissists make for their behavior. Now, have you ever had this happen to you? That a narcissistic person says, I'm just brutally honest after they've said something mean? Let's break that down, shall we? Because this is a very popular excuse that narcissistic people make for their behavior. I'm just brutally honest. Believe it or not, sometimes narcissistic people actually do know that their behavior is completely unacceptable. They're not psychotic, they know. And remember, because of the chronic feelings of inadequacy that often accompany narcissism and the shame that gets activated, people who are narcissistic don't like it, and they tend to either rage about it or make excuses for it. And remember, that's what this whole series of videos takes on, the kinds of excuses that narcissistic people make for their behavior. So you hear these, and you may even buy the excuses that narcissistic people make. But this one, and I say this a lot to people, it's my mantra: abuse is abuse, and history is no excuse. If someone emotionally or verbally or otherwise abuses you, then that's what they've done. They've abused you. Finding an excuse or an explanation doesn't make it okay. It's abuse. So let's start with one that they often come out with, because this is one I've heard so many times when narcissistic people, to excuse their behavior, will say, I'm just brutally honest. This excuse, I am brutally honest, is often how they will try to worm out of their insensitive and careless comments and their lack of empathy. It's the idea that when a person with a difficult personality just says something that could be cruel or dismissive or invalidating or mean, that actually they were just being honest, and that your hurt isn't really relevant or warranted because, in their mind, full frontal honesty is the best policy, right? Not so much. A person can be honest without being hurtful. A person can be mindful in their response, and while in some cases honesty may hurt, because sometimes it does, that's just the nature of honesty, it tends to be around more big ticket stuff, not in the day-to-day, careless, offhanded comments about everyday stuff. Nobody needs to get too brutally honest there. The brutally honest comment is also often used by enablers who will often excuse the narcissistic person's cruel behavior by saying, oh, come on now, they don't really mean it. They're just being brutally honest. You need to take what they're saying with a grain of salt. They're just brutally honest. No, you don't need to take what they're saying with a grain of salt. It's not okay. This excuse of being brutally honest is something that people who are raised by narcissistic parents will often hear. A narcissistic parent may speak numerous hurtful things to a child and will then say to the child, I'm just brutally honest. It's good for you to hear the truth. For me, I'm your parent. That really can mess a child up. They will equate hurt with communication. And then down the line, as other important people in their life, people at work, partners, communicate with them and say hurtful things, they may not know to push back. They'll say, oh, they're just being brutally honest. And they'll fall back into the belief that I just need to be tougher because after all, this person was just being brutally honest, just like dear old mom or dad. This also happens in romantic relationships where a narcissistic partner may say terrible things and then tell you this is true love because I can be brutally honest with you. Again, if you aren't signing up for the brutally honest club and it just keeps coming, then this is a self-serving excuse from a narcissistic person to not have to engage in behavioral inhibition and empathy. The same applies in the workplace, where a toxic boss may be given a free pass as being brutally honest, and this becomes a way to rationalize their verbal and emotional abuse of colleagues and employees. Our society places such a premium on transparency and openness, which are great. But then there's a risk of framing brutal honesty as a virtue. I do think honesty is a virtue, but I think that honesty merged with empathy is the best path forward. For us to think about how to talk to people about difficult issues, to catch ourselves before we make throwaway comments, to gauge where a person is at when we give them feedback, and solicit their engagement in a transparent conversation. Brutal honesty is a moment of disinhibition, and it's a weak excuse. I have no doubt that more than a few of you have heard this excuse be given repeatedly by people who are narcissistic, that they are just brutally honest, as an excuse for their unkind and dehumanizing words. And they will often turn around and twist it such that it is framed that the person on the receiving end of this so-called brutal honesty is actually the one with the problem. They're too sensitive or too fragile to hear it. Then the narcissistic person is able to excuse their hurtful behavior, keep their shame covered up, and keep going through the world as one person wrecking crews, all the while with brutal honesty. And as always, remember, there is no reasoning with someone who's narcissistic. So if you hear that as an excuse for their unkind behavior, just recognize what it is and start building those boundaries. And here's where it gets interesting and we get into the hypocrisy of narcissism. If you were to speak your truth and be brutally honest, be prepared for rage as big and as deep and as wide as the ocean. So that brutal honesty tends to be a one-way street. So that's that excuse. Love to hear if you have any ideas or any of the excuses that you've heard repeatedly from the narcissistic people in your life. Drop them in the comments or let us know. Thanks again.